Hi, everyone, and welcome. I'm really happy you're here today. I want to give you a couple more minutes to join the call. Today is the first of a series of masterclasses. Today, we are going to talk about something very practical, the art of diplomatic English. And more specifically, how to say more by saying it better. I see some familiar faces, which is great. Thank you so much for being here. And as I said, yes, this is the first of a series of master classes. So each month, starting today, we are going to look into some very practical business topics. We're going to talk about writing emails, negotiations. We're going to talk about persuasion, leadership. So each month there's going to be something a little bit different. We have 30 minutes to talk about this. So we're going to spend the next 30 minutes or so together. If you have any questions, feel free to share them in the chat, and I'm gonna do my very best to answer all of them at the end of the session. Now, let's begin. Without further ado, let's take a look at the first idea. So, learn how to say no without saying no, and you win most battles. Now, I want to take you back with me to my first day at work in the US. Now, um, it wasn't one of my first jobs, so I already had some experience, of course. By the time I moved to Florida, I had definitely acquired a lot of experience in client-facing roles. My background is mainly in events management, so I used to work in weddings, gala dinners, conferences, so a lot of high pressure events. And I thought I was ready. I was there ready. I remember the very first day of my training at the desk. I was part of an amazing team, great managers. The training itself was spot on. And I remember the day before my first day of training, I think it was something that I had automatically in my mind. Like I was like, oh, I need to review some grammar, I need to review some vocabulary. And I did it. I did a bit of a revision, like I always used to do. But then when I got to the desk, I realized that there are situations in which you have to say no without saying no. Now, there are situations, and I often had situations throughout my period in the US and even after, where people asked for things that were not possible. And so I couldn't just say no. It would sound rude, it would create tension. So I had to learn how to say it differently. And this is something that my manager, one of my managers, told me the very first day of my training, because I was like, "Well, how do you actually do it?" And he was like, "Oh, we're gonna teach you. You're gonna see. You're gonna observe. You're gonna notice, and you're gonna see how to talk to people differently." So, if you've ever been in a situation like this, I would like you to really think about what is your experience. Have you ever been in a conversation with your boss, with your colleagues, with a client, or even in your personal life, maybe your partner, maybe a friend, and you had to say no without saying no, or you had to be very careful about not hurting the other person's feeling. So you couldn't be too direct. And I would like you to think about a very specific example, Write it down on a little piece of paper because we're gonna go back to that throughout the masterclass. What I've learned throughout all these years of speaking and studying English is that we don't need more English. We need different English. And I am specifically talking about people who are at a B2, high B1, B2 level, right? You already know pretty much all the grammar you need to survive happily. And you already know all the grammar that you need to thrive in an environment where you need diplomatic English. The problem is school doesn't teach you how to apply the grammar to the situation, right? They just tell you the theory. They're like, oh, yes, you can use the past simple for finished events. Well, yes, that's one of the uses, but it's not the only one. So you will notice throughout these courses, these mini master classes that I'm presenting, that small changes often bring a big difference. So when you become more aware and more intentional with the language you use. So let's take a look at these sentences. You need to change this, or I want to talk to you. Now, have you ever been in a situation where you had to say something like this, maybe to a colleague or maybe to your boss, but you couldn't really say it like that? I want to add there is a very thick cultural layer here that we need to consider. There are some countries where communication is definitely more straightforward, and there are some countries where communication is way more indirect. So, part of your job is also to understand who you are talking to, what kind of language is appropriate in that kind of situation. But let's use English speaking countries and more specifically the UK for this exercise, right? Two sentences like this one in the UK would be considered quite blunt and straightforward. Depends on the situation, of course, but let's imagine you are talking to your boss, right? This is something that you do not necessarily hear in an average British office. Of course, there are some exceptions. Now, how do we change these directness, right? How do we make it a little bit softer? The first thing that you want to do is to use the past tense. So, for example, I want becomes I wanted. I need becomes I needed. So simple past, very easy. You already know this because probably, the past simple is one of the tenses that students learn pretty early. And so you already know this. You don't need anything new. But how many of you actually knew that you could use the past to be a little bit more diplomatic? Like, tell me in the chat. I'm curious now. Raise your hand if you knew. Okay, one person knew. Fine. I think yeah, we did it in class together. That's why. Okay. I thought I could use it just to talk about past events. Yeah, yeah. So this is the perfect example, right? So the real the real challenge here is to take all the grammar you know and use it differently. Okay, there's an interesting question. Why? Why do we need to use the past? Well, okay, so the real reason here is psychological distance, right? In English, politeness is often not about imposing too directly on the other person. So when you see the present, sentence is like, I want to ask you something. Now, this feels immediate, direct, potentially a bit pushy. Again, we need to look at the context, but in general, is something that sounds quite straightforward. So when you shift to the past, I wanted to ask you something. It feels less aggressive, right? Um, why? Because you are creating a kind of emotional and social buffer. It is not really about time here. It is really about distance, tentativeness. This is an attempt to understand something. And really giving the other person space, right? This idea of space is something that comes back often physically and verbally in many different cultures. I'm British Italian. I was born in Italy. I grew up in Italy. I moved to the UK when I was 20. I am 39 now. So I spent literally half of my life in Italy and half of my adult life in the UK. And I notice this concept of space every single day, both physically and when it comes to communication, right? So think of it like the past tense feels less urgent, it feels less forceful, it is more optional. So it's almost like saying, this is just a thought I had. You are free to respond however you like, although we need an answer, right? So you will notice this pattern everywhere in polite English. So things like, I was wondering if you could help me. I wanted to ask about the meeting. Did you want to join us? Now, all of these are not about the past. They are about softening the request. So the deeper linguistic idea, and if you want to be a little bit nerdy, English uses tenses not just for to explain a time frame, but also to explain how certain or direct something is. So the past tense here has the same job as could, would, might, or expressions like I think, maybe, perhaps. So, one thing that I want to point out here is that culture can be a little bit of an obstacle in some ways, because if your sentence is too polite and the other person doesn't understand the nuance of what you are saying, it can sound a little bit vague. People may struggle to understand what you really want. You may sound a little bit indecisive, right? So, and again, this is something that I had to learn pretty quickly in my job. There's a very thin line between diplomatic and polite and sounding passive, right? So, a useful way to see this, to look at this, is instead of thinking, I'm going to use the past tense for politeness, frame it as I'm going to use a little bit of distance to reduce the pressure. And this is where we can use past tense, modal verbs, and softeners. Now, another thing we can do is add a soft question. So things like, I was hoping if you could, or I wanted to ask if I may. So, soft questions, again, reduce uncertainty, reduce urgency, and reduce emotional intensity. They give the other person in the room um, time to respond without feeling judged or forced. Now, how do we do this in English? Instead of going straight to the point, English often wraps the question. So, for example, instead of saying, hey, can you help me? We would say, I was wondering if you could help me. Again, one more time. It is important to notice the context. If you are talking to a friend of yours, someone who you know really well, and you just need to move a box, of course, hey, can you help me? If you are talking to your boss and it is a project where you need to be careful, or maybe you are talking about, maybe you're talking to your client, and then of course that's where you need to be more careful. I was wondering if you could help me. Or for example, instead of saying, why is this late? We could go for something like, do you know why this might be late? Now, this requires a little bit of practice because if you have never used the past tense and soft questions in these contexts, they are not going to come up in your brain magically. When people say, oh, I don't remember things, well, because you need to use them intentionally. So put yourself in the situation where you need to use these and then intentionally use them. You need to think about these things. They're not just going to pop up in your mind randomly. Okay. Now, in these situations, it's all about social risk, right? Every question carries a little bit of risk, and I don't want you to misinterpret the word risk, but you might sound rude, you might embarrass someone, you might create tension. If you talk to a colleague and you say, why is this project late? Well, there is a strong hint of blame in what you are saying. So you want to make sure that, especially in workplace communication, customer service, in general, British culture, you want to soften, you want to approach what you are talking about a little bit more gently. It took me a fair amount of time to understand. I don't want to say that I master that, but I understood a couple of rules and I'm happy to share them with others. Now, this is the final result. I was hoping we could review this together. Polite, professional, clear. Boom, boom, boom. What we want to try and do is the same thing with this sentence. You are talking to a colleague, or even if you were talking to a member of your team, right? This is, little note, this is something that happens on in communication, also between levels of hierarchy. I had managers being extremely polite with me. Would you mind? Could you please? I was hoping you could. So it's not a matter of I'm going to talk like this just with my manager or my manager's manager. No, we talk like this even with people who are below us. So take a moment. I want to give you a couple of moments and try to change it. Use it using what we just learned. Now, once you've completed, once you're done, feel free to share your answer in the chat, and then we're going to look at them together. Cool. Okay, let's see. All right, first one. I was hoping you could send this today. Yeah, sure. That's perfectly fine. Um, if you say something like this to a person who has a good grasp of English, they will understand that they need to do it. It is not just a request that they can say no to. Okay. Okay, let's take a look at this other one. Could you please send this today? Yes, yes. It is definitely a little bit, there is more chances that the other person is gonna say no, but you can try and start with that and then see where the conversation leads you. Now, I would like you to think about this. How often do you need English in situations like this at work? Because when I first started working in English, I definitely would have benefited from these kind of techniques. The very first jobs I had in the UK were a little bit more hands-on. I used to work in Pret-a-Manger, and then I moved into events throughout all my studies. I worked at Pret, and then I moved into events, right? I started working in events at the end of my studies. But from the very beginning, I experienced so many situations in which I had to be diplomatic, even just to avoid someone shouting at me. But it was really challenging because I didn't have anyone who explained all these things to me. It was just a guessing game. So I want to do my part and I want to do my very best to help people feel a little bit more in control of their situation. Again, to avoid that someone may shout at them in their face. So think about in which situation you may need this kind of language at work. And now I want to tell you some situations that I experienced, meetings, feedback, giving and receiving feedback, disagreeing with others, difficult conversations, intercultural communication. Now, everything we've done today is really just one small example of how you can change the way you sound in English with very simple adjustments. But in real work situations, it's never just one sentence. You might need to disagree with someone. You might need to give feedback. You might need to explain something clearly or say no in a professional way. And that's exactly why I decided to create a series of mini courses that explain and do just that. Now, the first one of these series, it's called The Art of Diplomatic English. And what we do there is very simple, very practical. We take real situations from work like meetings, feedback, disagreement, and we practice how to handle them in a clear, confident, and professional way. So instead of overthinking every sentence, you start to recognize patterns and you know what to say and how to say it. Now, the course itself is fairly short. It consists of an introductory session and a final session that are live. So that's why it is a hybrid course. The beginning and the end, 30 minutes and 30 minutes are live with me, where we set goals. We understand exactly what we need to focus on because each one of you may have a different goal. And then in the final session, we wrap it up and we talk about our experience and what we learned from that. In the middle, there are 5 modules that are recorded. So that's for you to do in your own time. And you also get a workbook with all the activities. So in total, you're going to spend 2.5, maximum 3 hours on this. And the great thing is that you can also share your experience with other people. So you can read comments. There's a lot of communication involved with the other participants. So if what we did today was helpful to you and you'd like to go deeper, this is definitely something that you may want to look into. Now, you are going to receive a link to the course in the email if you attended this masterclass live or if you enrolled, if you registered for the masterclass. And you are also going to get a coupon discount code specifically if you participated to the masterclass. If you haven't participated to the masterclass, then you can find the course in the Business Hub section of my website. Okay. And I'm gonna find a way to put the link somewhere in this page when I'm going to post this video. Um, you are also, of course, going to receive the link to this session, to this masterclass in your email, so you can access it very easily. Now, are there any questions? Are there any questions? Let me know. We can take a look at this in these questions in the chat. All right. So the first question is, are there many other tricks and tips that you're going to share? Well, yes. Yes. And I think one of the main things about the main thing about the course is that it focuses a lot on the cultural side of communication because of course you know the grammar, and so we're going to look at the grammar that you already know, and we are going to apply it to situations that are relevant to you. But we're also going to talk a lot about the cultural side of it. So how do people communicate in different cultures? How can you understand the person in front of you, not just linguistically, but also culturally? So, yes, there's going to be a lot of tips and tricks and techniques and strategies shared in the course. Definitely. Um, one more question. Let's see. How long did it take you to master this? I had to get very good very quickly because I didn't really have a choice. I was working in a very high stake position, and I just had to get creative. I just had to listen to whatever was happening around me, being inspired, get inspired by all the amazing people I work with, and do a little bit of my own research. So let's say if you have to be diplomatic regularly at work and you use these techniques practically and intentionally at work, you are going to see a very quick improvement, and it's going to feel very clear to you. Of course, the less you use these techniques, the more time it takes. It is all about repetition and how often we practice things. So there is no specific time frame, like a month, 2 months, 6 months. It is a really personal experience, but it can be done pretty fast. Once you get into it, it can be pretty quick. Now, I would love to thank you for being here today. It was a pleasure to see you all. I hope I'm going to see you in the next masterclass. And I think we're going to talk about, if I'm not mistaken, I think we're going to talk about client hospitality. So, what to do when a client is visiting us. Um, Let me know, of course, if you have any questions. And in the meantime, thank you so much. I'm gonna see you soon.